Making the news a lot in the last couple of weeks has been the story of Corinthian Colleges Incorporated and the Corinthian 15, now grown significantly in number, but originally a group of 15 students who took out student loans, became indebted to this for-profit corporation, which held the ownership of their colleges, and went bankrupt, and is now this group is now seeking relief from those loans by going on strike against them. It is a movement that is growing. It is sponsored by in part and collaborated with by the Debt Collective. And joining us now are two people who know a lot about the Corinthian case. Hannah Appel is an assistant professor of anthropology at UCLA. She is an economic anthropologist, and her research and teaching interests are guided by what she calls the economic imagination. Dawn Lueck is the former corporate finance manager for Heald College, one of the colleges owned by Corinthian. Hannah and Dawn, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us. Hi, thank you.
Welcome, please, and thank you for taking the time. And now, listen, let's start with this. I mean, I think most of our audience is probably familiar with the Corinthian story, but the short version is Corinthian got into financial trouble, was on the verge of closure, at which point some relief would be available to the students who had taken out loans. The Department of Education stepped in and, in effect, brokered a deal that prevented that from happening, and now these students want relief. Hannah, is that a fair summary of the situation?
Yeah, I think that is a fair summary of the situation, although I would say that from the very beginning, the idea that some debt relief would be available to current and former Corinthian students, either on the ground that their school was closing or on the ground that they had incurred the debt under fraudulent circumstances. The reason this for-profit school shut down or went bankrupt is, in effect, it was under investigation by, over 20 attorneys general. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was suing them. So in other words, there were actually multiple options from the beginning, theoretically, through which these students could seek some debt relief, and the Department of Education foreclosed all of those options from the very beginning, including, as you say, in brokering a deal behind closed doors through a totally obscure process to get this, a debt collector.
Right.
Sold the Corinthian properties to ECMC, which was the government's debt collector.
I have to tell you that in hearing about the story of how this was handled by the government and how an opportunity for relief for these students was replaced with, in effect, continued indebtedness and continued association with I would call it discredited organization, it brought to mind the Treasury Department's handling of homeowners and homeowner relief, where the banks were rescued, but the students were not. Now, that may be unfair. We'll talk about that a little bit. But Dawn, in your position as finance director for Heald College, you have said that basically they were creating a system to generate federally backed student loans that contributed to the bottom line. Is that a fair summary of what you saw?
Yes, but I guess the way that I would word it is I think that these for-profit institutions found an opportunity to capitalize. There's a rule in higher education. It's called the 90-10 rule, and it basically stipulates how an organization can obtain their funding. Up to 90% of that funding can come from federally backed either grants, which is money that's not repaid, or federal student loans. And when if you just scale back and look at the investors and who the major investors of Corinthian College, which is Wells Fargo for one, and it's just very questionable the investment that the DOE, the Department of Education, has. What is their interest in seeing that Corinthian was bailed out, knowing that these organizations, like you said, they've been obtaining, they make millions of dollars, maybe even billions every year, and 90% of that already comes from federal funding.
So, in effect, one of the things they're doing here is We saw a lot of publicity around this rescue or bailout, I'm tempted to call it, in the sale to a debt collection agency of Corinthian's assets as colleges. Now, which meant that these students had to continue. They weren't available for this debt relief and so on. Now, we did hear that something like $480 million in private student loans would be forgiven, but I had a lot of questions about that. And Dawn, maybe let's start with you. Number one was the vast majority of the loans the students took out by 9-1, as I understand it, were federal loans, and this was not relief for the federal loans that was offered to students, right?
Correct. And there's so much ambiguity around, what they've announced in terms of they've negotiated relief. There's so many outstanding questions about that. But, what's happened with the for-profit model is so what the companies realized, I started with ITT Technical Institute back in 1999, and the last 13 years I've seen the steady increase in the cost of tuition and the fees and all of that just climbing and climbing. And what I think they realized is if they hike up the prices enough, they can cover themselves with the 90-10 rule, because if the charges are more than the federal funding that the student brings in, well, then they've got to make up that difference somewhere. And that's where they came with these, absolutely ridiculous terms associated to these private loans. There's still so much questions around what are the loan terms. Students don't even have copies of their loan agreements. They're not getting access to their accounts to get clarity on what are their interest rates. And I can just tell you from working for Hild College, one of the main loans that we've been talking about is the Genesis loan. There's a lot of issues with this. These students are being raped by fees and late fees and interest and all of this stuff for these private loans. But when I was a part of the organization and we were implementing Genesis, what really stands out in my mind was the lack of transparency around the design of these loan programs. There was a really small group of individuals that were included in the discussions. When we rolled out the loan programs to the schools for them to start signing up the students, the website was horrendous to deal with. The employees, the financial administrators were just as confused as the students. And at the end of the day, the students signed all these things electronically. I don't know how often they actually obtained any kind of printed, written communication as to what these Genesis loans were about. And so that in itself just makes you wonder, why was there so much chaos around these loans? What were they trying to cover up?
What were they trying to cover up, and why has this not come to light? And I look at something like this offer of forgiving a percentage of these private loans, quote unquote, and I think, well, to what extent back in the back room deals or changes in ownership of these loans, has that been written off anyway? Is this another one of those deals where you look like you're giving something away, but you're not really? And meanwhile, these students are left with nine.
Sorry, can I say something about that quickly?
Who's this?
This is Hannah.
I was just going to switch to you, Hannah, so go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, so I'm really glad you brought up that, you mentioned the $480 million figure. Basically, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has under its jurisdiction as a regulatory body private loans, right? So the CFPB,
sure,
as a regulatory body, stepped in and sued Genesis Lending, which was the sort of in-house private lending loan sharking project of Corinthian colleges that Dawn is talking about. They sued to get that money back, to get that particular debt relieved. That lawsuit is still pending, but it looks like they've kind of worked out a deal in the background with ECMC to slash a bunch of that debt and to also make it more difficult for debt collectors to collect on the parts of that debt that weren't slashed. I should say that, we work
but Hannah,
with, yes.
Just to interrupt you for a second, Hannah, I'm not even sure how, from my own point of view, my own background, I'm not even sure how real that $488 million is. In other words, I think it may have been written off already. It's one of those things where, and in addition, it doesn't address the larger loans that are federally backed. And it seems to me as if that It seems to me as if the Department of Education has acted in the interests of its own budgetary demands rather than in the interests of these students. That's the
Yes.
way it looks to me. Is that a fair statement?
I completely agree. And what I think is happening, what seems to me, as kind of an organizer on the ground with these students, many of whom are technically affected by this Genesis, gift, quote unquote, as you say, but are actually having trouble. They don't see any kind of slash in their Genesis debt. What I see is that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is stepping out and essentially challenging the Department of Education, who is the regulator in effectively 90% of this insurmountable debt, right? So the CFPB actually just has jurisdiction over a very, very small amount that happens to be Genesis lending because it's private. The Department of Education has a 90% jurisdiction and has done nothing. So I agree. I think sort of in the economic minutia of it, what the CFPB is doing is certainly not going to give that much relief. But in the wider sort of political landscape, I think the CFPB is effectively issuing a challenge to the Department of Education, as are the rest of us, because the Department of Education, I actually feel perfectly comfortable with your analogy to the bailout. They have, bailed out Wall Street and sold out Main Street. The Department of Education is effectively acting as a debt collector, very, very far from a regulator, let alone, a body that's supposed to support education.
And before we go back to Dawn, Hannah, let me ask you this. You're an anthropologist. I have said in writing and just personally in reviewing the bank bailout that this is the perfect study for an anthropologist somewhere, how it is that decision makers in Washington apparently feel more closer kinship ties with the people perpetrating some of these harms than they do to the victims of these harms, and that somehow there's a psychology that goes on or an affinity that gets developed where they're comfortable doing this, which would seem immoral in the abstract, one would think, and therefore the need for something like the Corinthian 15 to step up and put a human face on the people being harmed by their actions. Is that one of the things that the Debt Collective is trying to support the students in accomplishing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one could imagine if there had been organized mass collectivities of homeowners undergoing foreclosure who knew they were being robo-signed, right, who knew their documents were robo-signed, who understood, even in a kind of inchoate way, that they were being taken merciless advantage of and even subject to illegal practices. Had homeowners been organized at that time, and I will say that in terms of debt collective work, we imagine that there's still potential for this going forward, we could have potentially seen a different outcome at that point. And that's precisely the idea of the debt collective, right, is what does it mean now that the vast majority of us have to personally finance the basic things we need to get by, right? We have to go into massive debt for our education, even if it's public. We have to go into massive debt for our medical care. That means that debtors need to be essentially sort of new labor unions. Most of us don't have jobs where we can unionize, but all of us have debt, and there are new forms of organizing that can put debtors at the table to renegotiate the terms on which we take this debt, or even if we should debt finance education, and the debt collective believes that we shouldn't. The debt collective believes that there should be a legitimate public option in education, and debtors have to organize to push for that to be a real political option.
Well, I not only believe that there should be a legitimate public option for education, I believe that past debt should be forgiven for anyone, because I don't think it's consistent with a moral society. Dawn, going back to you for a second. So you were business manager, I believe that was the term, or finance manager for one of the Corinthian colleges. Looking back on it now, do you feel regret? Are you, speaking up now as a way of putting things back in balance? Or, how do you feel when this story gets discussed?
Oh my gosh, I just live through so much passion associated to this movement. The Corinthian 15, the individuals that have stepped forward and are publicly refusing to pay back their loans, they are true leaders. They understand the moral issues. They are stepping outside of their story of victim, and they're becoming empowered. And I really think that we're going to see so much momentum with this growing, because it's so inspiring for people to really be able to stand in the power and and say, wait a minute, I didn't do anything wrong. I was doing what society told me to do. Go get a job. It'll give me a better life. And now that they're in a state where their lives are far more vulnerable and more challenging than they were before they even started school. This is something that I'm just absolutely thrilled to be a part of. And in my experience, in the 13, 14 years that I was in higher education, and most of that was spent in financial aid, one of my greatest concerns that I do want to bring voice to within this system is the fact that, number one, this is a highly regulated industry, the higher education. There's so many layers and hands that are responsible for auditing, checking compliance, ensuring that there are healthy and practical business practices. So for the fact that companies like Corinthian College and ITT Tech and DeVries have gone on for so long manipulating, misleading individuals, they've preyed on vulnerable communities. The Department of Ed has been aware of it. The accrediting agencies, they are aware of it. So it just feels like there's just such a large pool of individuals that need to be held accountable. And the last point that I want to make is...
briefly, because we're running out of time.
Thank you. The last thing is when it comes to financing, there's a big issue where the Department of Ed is lending based off of a need, not the ability to repay. That's also something else we need to talk about.
Right. And perhaps we'll have you guys back on to talk about this a little more, because I think the other issue, too, is that the Department of Education's budget is affected by the decisions it makes for or against indebted students. And I think that's an inherent conflict of interest. I will close with this. Hannah, you'll get the final word, but I've been to your website. I was very impressed with the people who joined this strike are very courageous, given the way our society restricts our freedoms based on our credit score, among other things. So it's a very brave thing to do. I was very impressed with your site's screening process to see who should and shouldn't join this process based on personal situation and so on. So where can people go, Hannah, to learn more about the Debt Collective and the Corinthian 15?
Absolutely. Thanks for ending there. We have a website. It's debtcollective.org, debtcollective.org, and you can find all of the information you need there. We are really searching for all Corinthian students, current and former. So if you went to Heald, if you went to WyoTech, if you went to Everett College, please get in touch with us. We will put you through a rigorous intake process to see if becoming a striker is the right thing for you, or if you should get involved in some of our other tactics that present less risk and try to sort of leverage legal loopholes. And also for those of you who have student debt but are not from those schools, there are places for you to sign up. And for people out there who are hearing what we're doing and are supportive of it, all of us are volunteers. Some of us, like me, are fortunate enough to have full-time jobs. Many of the people who do this kind of work either don't have jobs at all or are working minimum wage jobs, and we're trying to do all of this organizing on the side. So if you can donate anything to help us with our work, including in the very niche.
Okay, Hannah, gotta go.
15 to DC. Thank you.
Okay, and I gotta leave it there. Hopefully, both of you guys will come back and talk to us again. Hannah Appel, professor of anthropology; Dawn Lueck, former corporate finance manager at Heald College. Thank you both for joining us. I am Richard RJ Eskow. We'll be back after this. This is the Zero Hour.